Christian nationalism's influence has grown steadily in the United States in the second Trump administration. So what does this mean for the country's future? And how has Christian Zionism influenced the United States' support of Israel and the genocide in Gaza? This week on UpFront, I'll be asking those questions to University of Pennsylvania Chair of Religious Studies, Dr. Anthea Butler. Anthea Butler, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mark.
For years, we've heard about the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States. But, since Donald Trump took office, the political influence of this particular group of Christians has only grown. But I still don't think we necessarily have a good sense of what Christian nationalism actually is. How would you explain it?
I would explain it somewhat like this. First of all, you think about America as being a Christian nation, right? That's something that's just ingrained in everybody. But Christian nationalists take it to the extreme. They believe that the founding of this nation was for Christians and Christians only, that, the white men who came over, whether they were Puritans or others that came over, this was their divine right to be here, that God created this nation to be protected, and that this was supposed to be for Christians and Christians only, and everybody else, just not really particularly involved in the everyday affairs of the nation. The way I like to talk about Christian nationalism is you can't separate it from race. You need to think about whiteness when you talk about Christian nationalism, because there's something implicit in that term Christian nationalism that also means white. And that means that you have white men who are in leadership. God has appointed them to be in leadership. And that also means that those who are under them need to follow Christian rules, and that the nation is inextricably bound. It's bound to this idea that God created this nation, it is for a divine purpose, and that the nationalism that you see that people have, whenever somebody says, God bless America, we sort of invoke that, and we don't even realize that we're invoking a term of Christian nationalism.
So what's different now? If it's a term that's been used since day one,
yeah.
What does it mean to be in the midst of a Christian nationalist kind of almost renaissance in the era of Trump 2.0?
Yeah, it's not simply that you can say, God bless America, or you're praying for the nation. Now it means that Christianity gets embedded in government. So basically when we talk about the separation of church and state, as Thomas Jefferson would have talked about it when he wrote that letter to Danbury Baptist, now we're talking about Christianity being an explicitly privileged religion over and against every other religion in America, which isn't how this nation was founded, right? The founders wanted...
Well, how do we reconcile that with the idea that this was a Christian nation?
Yeah, because basically at the beginning, those founders were like, we're trying to escape persecution from England and all the rest of these people who want to impose a religion on us. We don't want to impose it on anybody. Most of those founders were deists. They didn't even believe that God was involved in everyday affairs in this nation. Now what we have is an administration who's saying we're going to privilege Christians over everyone else, period, end of story. And that the way in which you see Christianity operating in 2025 is very different than the way, say, Billy Graham operated that Christian nationalism in the 1950s. So I think there's a profound difference, because Christianity is being wielded as a weapon in terms of how this nation is being run and how people get talked about as being, not Christian, not particularly involved in Christianity, and that ends up being a measure. So the kinds of things that the administration is doing right now, whether they're privileging Christianity or going after anti-Christian bias, for instance, means that if you're not Christian, this is going to be a problem for you.
So, as you describe Christian nationalism, I'm hearing a lot about foundation of governments. I'm hearing about politics. Yeah. I'm hearing about laws. I'm not hearing a lot of God talk. How Christian is Christian nationalism?
Not very. I mean, if you think about it in terms of, what people call the red letter of the gospel, the words of Jesus, right? You don't hear the word Jesus very much. You hear about God and you hear about law. And so the way I would tell somebody to listen for Christian nationalism is to say, did you hear anybody say Jesus? Did you hear somebody say something about the golden rule? Did you hear anybody say turn the other cheek? You don't hear that when you talk about Christian nationalism. When I hear Christian nationalism in this country, and especially with this particular administration, I hear it as punitive. It is, an Old Testament God, or, if you want to talk about it like this, Hebrew Bible God, instead of a New Testament kind of environment of Christianity. So that's one. The second thing I think that's really important about this to think about in terms of Christian nationalism and how people deal with it, there's an element of capitalism in it. And I think that's also important. The way that people talk about prosperity, the way they talk about God blessing the nation, right? You get blessed if you're a Christian, but if you're not Christian, you're not going to get blessed financially or otherwise. And if we have to think about Christian nationalism alongside of prosperity, I think it's a very compelling way to think about this administration and the ways in which Christian nationalism has morphed, I'd say since 2000, actually.
So I'm glad you talked about that morphing, because Christian nationalism as a movement has its roots in the 1960s and 70s, but really kind of takes its highest heights now.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I like to put it in a couple of ways. One is I think it's a backlash to the 2008 election, the election of
Obama backlash.
The Obama backlash. That's number one. So we're talking about race there, because if you remember during the Obama era, it was all about was he really a Christian? Was he a Muslim? All of that, and then the asking for the papers, and that was Trump basically asking, is he really born in America? All of this stuff, the birtherism, right? So that's one thing. So that hooks into the nation. That hooks into, are you really part of this nation or not? So that's number one. Number two, in the rise of this was, you could think about it as terms of being Trump. Back when he ran for election in 2015, he didn't pick up the normal, big time names of Christians. He picked what I called back then the D list. I wrote
When you say
about
picked out Christians, you mean for like surrogates?
Yeah, for surrogates for himself. He picked prosperity gospel people. He picked people like Paula White. He picked those people who were directly connected not just to the faith, but also connected to prosperity gospel, right? So that fit in with his business sense.
So I've heard you use this word before. What exactly is a prosperity gospel?
Well, the prosperity gospel believes that God wants you to be rich. God wants to prosper you in your life financially, health-wise, everything else. It used to be called, name it and claim it, or the health and wealth gospel. But in the late 80s, it started to be called the prosperity gospel, right? And basically what you have are preachers who said something like, if you just give me money, you tithe your offerings, God is going to bless you, right? So basically what you have are people who believe that Christianity and capitalism are inextricably mixed. They are mixed together. And what it means is that if you're a good Christian, you also should be prosperous. And Donald Trump exemplifies that. No matter what you think about his Christianity, whether you think he's a Christian or not, for many believers, people believe that he's God's man on earth because he's rich, he's a businessman, he became the president, and that is the reason why they back him.
So how does Donald Trump become the figurehead of this? If you're an evangelical Christian, if you are a Christian nationalist, and you want somebody that embodies your values, whether we agree with those values or not, around sexual propriety, around honesty, around humility, around grace, around mercy, around all these things, it wouldn't seem to many people that Donald Trump would be the poster child of that. Why would he become the person that they would think would be God's messenger on earth?
So let me say something that's probably going to be really scary for some folks. Race trumps religion. In other words, in this particular case, because he appeals to their whiteness, they are able to overlook all of these other things that might not be moral. I think that's one of the most important things to talk about when we talk about evangelicals, is that we try not to say, oh, they're really racist or whatever. But I wrote a whole book about this where I talk about, the politics of morality. And the politics of morality means that basically, if you have a white man who has a position of power, like Trump, and he doesn't seem to follow all these tenets of Christianity, then he's more forgivable than somebody who doesn't have a lot of money and who is seen to be a troublemaker and might be brown, black, or yellow, or whatever. They don't have the same kind of power that a Donald Trump would have.
Got you. There are figures in Trump's circle who are very closely associated with Christian nationalism and white supremacism.
Yes.
People like Secretary of Defense Pete Hexith, who even wrote a book called American Crusade. And in that book, he said, we don't want to fight, but like our fellow Christians 1,000 years ago, we must. How does having someone like Hexith influence public policy?
Well, that's dangerous because it really influences public policy in different ways. I should know this because basically when he took a visit to the Naval Academy, they pulled my book along with 300 other books. So that's number one. So
it wasn't to cite the book as a...
No, it wasn't to cite the book. It had something to do with race, right? So that's the first thing. But I think the way that influences public policy is this. If you think about him being over the Department of Defense, then you have people who are talking about our military having to basically accede to Christian beliefs. And we have many people who are not Christian who are in the military in all branches of the military. And so when you have a leader like that, that is going to seep down to, to the ranks. And then you have people who are finding themselves not being able to express their faith maybe in the same way because the leader of the Department of Defense is saying, we want Christian values here. So I think that's going to become, in the future, an interesting issue, especially for the military.
It also makes me think about not just who's in the U.S. military, but who the U.S. military is targeting its attacks towards. If the idea here is that there's a collective we, and that we as Christians who have to fight, then what does that mean for incursions in the Middle East or Latin America or the continent of Africa or any place where we see someone as an other, either the wrong kind of Christian or not Christian at all?
It means that you go back to what Hexith said about Crusade. I mean, the first Crusades were against Muslims and Christians and Jews in Spain, right? And so that's a big history. And when you use that word crusade, that is a very loaded word. It means that you believe your religion is the religion that should be over all the rest of them, first of all, and that secondarily, everybody else is an infidel. And so I think that the way that influences public policy, we can already see it.
But you mentioned Pete Hexith, but also we could talk about Russ Vought, the key architect behind Project 2025, House Speaker Mike Johnson, who called the separation of church and state in the United States a misnomer. These are people very highly ranking in U.S. government. I guess my question is, with individuals like these in positions of power, how real is the possibility that the United States could shift from a democracy to a theocracy? Absolutely
real, and it's already happening. I think that people who think that it's not happening should take another look at the kinds of rules are being put down. And if we even think about just things that are happening in the states right now where, people are being told they need to put up 10 commandments in the schools, or you need to buy the Trump Bible for $59.95 in Oklahoma, or you need to think about how we think about abortion, and you think about the fall versus Roe versus Wade here a couple of years ago. All of these things are really important and speak to this idea about theocracy, right? I think one of the ones that people don't even think about very much is this idea that was floated by U.S. government that we give $5,000 to people who have a newborn baby. Now, who gets to get that $5,000? Does a black woman get that $5,000, or does a white woman who's married get $5,000? I want to know, because I think this is really interesting. So that's the other piece of this, is that there's ways in which these Christian ideas float into, almost permeate every area of governmental life.
Make the case for me for why this isn't just ordinary United States smuggling its Christianity into law like it has for hundreds of years. Why is this suddenly an actual theocracy?
This is a suddenly actual theocracy because that Project 25 that you alluded to from Voight has been going on for a long time. People just thought about Project 2025, but the Heritage Foundation had a book about this in the 1980s. This has been a decades-long project, a takeover, if you will. And the ways in which God was already infused in our government, whether we put in God we trust on a penny or a dollar or whatever, in the 1950s, this is very different. This is changing everything from top to bottom. So the kinds of civil liberties and things that people have are being taken away by people who believe that you should live the way that they want you to live and not the way that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights have talked about how you should live in this country.
I want to explore another dimension of Christian nationalism. For over a year and a half, we've been watching Israel commit a genocide in Gaza with U.S. support. During this time, the Christian Zionist movement has been one of the most vocal supporters of these efforts. While not all Christian nationalists are Zionists, there does seem to be considerable overlap. Can you explain what Christian Zionism is and how it intersects with Christian nationalism?
Yeah, Christian Zionism is a belief that the nation of Israel is a chosen nation, first of all, that God, Jesus comes from Israel and all of this stuff, right? So you put the biblical.
Now, is that biblical Israel, or is that like the government?
Biblical Israel, but it's also kind of mixed in with the government, right?
Gotcha.
So that's number one. But the second part of it, which I think is really important, and we have to think about organizations like Christians United for Israel, is that Israel is very important for Christians because if you believe that Jesus is going to come back, where does Jesus come back to? The plain of Megiddo. He comes back there to fight Satan and do all this stuff. So it's about end times beliefs. So for Christians who believe this way, they believe that the nation of Israel is a very important part of fulfilling biblical prophecy. All right. So in this sense, the way in which when this war between Israel and Gaza started, when the attacks happened back on October 7th, one of the things that happened in Christian nationalism, Christian Zionist circles, was that they realized, oh, this might mean that Jesus is coming back really soon, and this may be leading up to that last battle. So that became a very important moment. So all this talk can't be eradicated from what is happening there, because the Zionist part also goes with the Christian nationalist part, because you see, in the way that the prophecy works for them, Israel and the United States are linked together. Wow. And so that.
Now, I know that part ain't in the Bible. I ain't the most religious person, but I ain't never seen the United States in the Bible.
No, but basically, who is that governor, the general who said, "Oh, America was in the Bible," and I was like, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" But yeah.
But let me ask you about this, because it's not just that Christian nationalist eschatology, their sort of vision of how the end of days happens, is tied up in politics. It seems to be an anti-Semitic narrative as well.
Yeah.
In this version of events, Jesus comes back, but Jews are either killed or forcibly converted.
Exactly, and this is. Do
they not see that as anti-Semitic?
Well, no, they don't. They believe that it's the end of this is what it's supposed to be, right? That the two of these are going to come together, and they don't see that as being anti-Semitic. So the ways in which things are playing out right now are very interesting. I've asked people this a lot of times. Do you realize they really want you to become Christian in the end? And they're like, oh yeah, but it's okay, right? And I think that that's a part of what's happening here, and even the ways in which some of the Christian nationalist things are being purported, there's a sense in which they don't understand Judaism to begin with, right? And so if we think about, back a few years ago, back in 2012, when it was an election cycle back then, I'm thinking about there was a big meeting called The Response. It was prayer meetings. And at this prayer meetings, you would have, Christians blowing shofars. I mean, this is not your instrument of religion. This is for a specific purpose in Judaism. But they have appropriated prayer shawls and talits and all of these things, and they're Christians. It's not for them.
Would I be going too far to say that many of these Christian nationalists are pro-Israel and anti-Semitic?
Yeah, but I don't know that all of them would realize that they're anti-Semitic. And I think that's the point here. They think that because they love the nation of Israel and that they want to see Jesus come back, that these things are not incompatible, right? But in a sense, for us talking here, we, and scholars, they really are, because you're not allowing people to be the religious tradition that they were born into or that they converted to.
In 2023, in response to widespread pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses, the United States Congress introduced a bill that codified a particular definition of anti-Semitism into federal law. They introduced a bill that effectively disallowed any real criticism of Israel. And while many conservatives backed it, some, like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, pushed for religious exemption within the bill because it could, quote, convict Christians for believing in the gospel that says Jesus was handed over to Herod to be crucified by the Jews. How do Christian conservatives reconcile support for Israel with beliefs like these? Not just the end-of-day stuff, but one of the most fundamental arguments of the anti-Semitic person is that the Jews killed Jesus.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why this is wrong. Okay, so let's just say Marjorie Taylor Greene is wrong from the very jump, because basically this is the way also that a lot of Catholics thought that they should hate the Jews, because they said Jews killed Jesus. This is not true. This is not how this played out, and this is a misreading of Scripture. So I want to say that up front first, because I think people should understand that. Second, As someone who worked on anti-Semitism before October 7th and did this as part of the work that I do as a religious scholar, I can tell you that this definition is not the definition beforehand. We had groups like Stormfront and others who have done, very grievous things in this country to the Jewish community. We were having problems with anti-Semitism long before October 7th, okay? We can talk about the history of how Jews were persecuted in this country, not allowed to join certain kinds of country clubs, not, just like black people, not allowed to get into pools, all this kind of stuff. So we've had anti-Semitism in this country. This redefinition, however, has made it very difficult for anybody to say anything.
Right, now using the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's not it. And when we talk about this definition, we're talking about people who would even say that they're Holocaust deniers.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to understand that this redefinition is also hurting the Jewish community. Because what it does is it takes away the attention from people who are truly anti-Semitic, who are doing things to the Jewish community, and puts it on people who are protesting a war that has other things to do with it, but is not this definition of anti-Semitism as they've come up with in Congress.
So the pro-Palestinian protester gets called anti-Semitic simply for criticizing Israeli apartheid.
Yeah.
The Christian Zionist does not get criticized, even though they're actually endorsing anti-Semitic narratives.
That is correct.
How do we change that?
I don't know that we can change that right now. I will be honest with you, as a religious studies scholar, I see this being misappropriated. And I don't know that in this present environment that we can change that. I will tell you that I'm very disturbed by this, and that the kinds of anti-Semitism that really should be addressed, that have not been addressed fully before, will not get addressed with this new definition that is simply about criticism and expressing a political opinion, as opposed to actual anti-Semitism that is targeting people that will try to kill people. I think about the synagogue that was taken over in Texas a few years ago, where a rabbi was taken captive, and they had to go in and do this. We have anti-Semitic slogans all over my state of Texas, in Austin and in other places. These are real events. And so when we don't deal with that, and we're dealing with, protests on campuses, we need to realize those are two very different things.
The interesting thing about Christian nationalism for me is the influence that it has. I mean, if you look at the actual number of people in the United States who are Christian nationalists versus the amount of power that Christian nationalism has, it's quite stunning. There's been a movement to push back against the more extreme parts of their agenda. What forms of resistance are you seeing, and what's the impact?
I think the kind of impact that I'm seeing comes on several levels. One is, you could think about a national level with recently Reverend William Barber going to have prayer in the Capitol and being arrested with groups of people and standing out. I think back to the beginning of the inauguration this year, where Bishop Budd talked, specifically to ask for mercy for immigrants from Donald Trump, and he got very upset. But that kind of galvanized the liberal Christian community, as it were, the moderate Christian community. Now, it may seem like there are a lot of people who are very conservative who are also Christian nationalists, but I would say that they are the loudest voices in the room. In other words, they have the media, they have the print media, they have the kinds of media that gets out into a kind of ecosystem, right? But what we don't hear are these other voices every day that are saying, this doesn't really quite work, or the school teacher who's doing something different, or the religious leader that's doing something different. I think what we have to think about in this country, especially here and around the world, quite frankly, is how do you start to talk about religion in different ways? There's always been a clash against, people who want to use religion for power purposes, whether we're talking about Christianity or Hinduism or Judaism or, honestly, Buddhism. People don't think about that with Buddhism, but that's happened. But I also think that there are ways in which people should understand that religion has also been used to fuel civil rights. If we think about our own civil rights movement in this country, or we think about other movements around the world, it's been very important to think about how religion, helped people. I think there's ways in which we can look at this now and see that there can be a different way. But the question will be, will this win out, or will these Christian nationalists hook up with the tech bros and make something very much bigger than it already is?
What's your prediction? What's going to happen?
I think the latter, unfortunately, because I think people like Peter Thiel and others who have Christian beliefs, who also are very powerful, who are technocrats, are banding together to do something. And I think it's going to be very important to see how this all falls out in the next few years, because putting the nationalism with religion and putting that with new technological advances like AI are going to change the way people, experience the world and also receive knowledge. And I think that's going to change everything in a very different way.
Professor Anthea Butler, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
Thank you, Mark.